there's so many different factors as to how I stopped binging. It was compassion for myself. It was making sure I was eating enough during the day. People often see binge eating as eating too much or this like loss of control. It's actually a restrictive eating disorder. If you're
Mm,
binging, you are restricting. So we want to figure out when you're restricting. Why are you restricting? Is it because you're just not hungry because of the medication? Or is it because you're intentionally trying to restrict? And then you don't want to talk to anyone about it. But being able to talk to someone about it and opening up about it can help reduce some of that shame because we want to figure out why is this going on and how can we, support you in stopping.
Welcome to Successful with ADHD. I'm Brooke Schnittman. Let's get started.
Hello, hello. I'm so excited to be here,
I'm
truly.
excited to have you. Brittany is a registered dietitian. No Food Fears is her handle. We go way back. Brittany, tell me what's going on for you.
Yes. Well, I feel like it's been so long since I was part of your group. It was what, 2020, like right in the beginning of the pandemic. Since
Yeah.
then, I had lost my full-time job just through the pandemic at working at a hospital. And I'm solely working in private practice with a main focus on intuitive eating, helping people just heal their relationship with food. And I also love working with people with ADHD. It's like something that I feel so passionate about because it's something that I've lived with and I know firsthand what it might feel like eating on certain medications and feeling hyper fixated on certain tasks and forgetting to eat. So there's so much there when it comes to nutrition and ADHD that we're, first learning in recent years.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that connection with binge eating and searching
Yes.
for dopamine.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And what's so interesting, and so I'll explain, when I first was diagnosed, I was attending a private school in New York and
Mm-hmm.
I was in 7th grade. And prior to that, I definitely had struggles in school, but essentially I was about to get kicked out of school. They said Brittany is failing out. She's getting, C's and D's, and we don't think this is the right environment for her. And my parents were freaking out because I got into this great school. Missy and I were there, my sister together,
Mm-hmm.
and they sent me to get tested for learning disabilities and ADHD. Unsurprisingly, I had ADHD and they started me on medication and I went from getting C's and D's to A's and B's almost immediately.
Wow.
Like it was
Just from
like
the medication.
just from the medication, it was like
And what did they prescribe you?
I tried everything. I believe the first one was maybe like Ritalin and then
Mm-hmm.
Concerta. And then I think I
Mm-hmm.
tried like Vyvanse and Adderall.
Mm-hmm.
And the best way to describe it is like a light switch turned on. I was able to not just focus more, but actually retain the information. And I always think about how hard it is for neurodivergent folks in a regular school system. It is not designed for us
Right.
to learn all of this information and to sit there for like 8 hours a day. And I have all of my report cards from middle school and high school. And what's so funny is every single teacher described my ADHD symptoms, but nobody said Brittany should get
It's
tested. So it's like,
ADHD.
yeah, they were like, Brittany's, it's really hard for her to pay attention in class. She's always turned around 180
Mm-hmm.
degrees. Like, she has so much potential. And I did have so much potential. And I will never forget my teacher, my science teacher at the time. Oh no, it was either a college counselor or somebody else that I was working with. And they said, you know what? You should not take anatomy and physiology because it's too much memorization. And I went back
Wow.
to my high school years later and I said, I just want to let you know that I ended up getting a master's degree in science.
Yeah.
And, it sucks that I was dissuaded from pursuing something that I was
Oof.
passionate about because I ended up going on to do incredibly well in my master's program. And I
You were
just needed
motivated.
that extra love. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. What teachers say, good or bad, they stick for years to come. And thank God you were resilient enough to go ahead and move forward and get your master's in science.
And by the way, it was not easy. Like I had to work twice as hard as most of my peers, but it was something that I felt so passionately about and
Uh-huh.
something I wanted so badly. Like I would have these like visualizations of me getting accepted into my grad school program. I would have visualizations of me, walking down the stage, getting my diploma, and I did it. And I don't know if I could do it again. It was really hard, but I did
Yeah.
it and I loved it.
Well, visualization really works. It helps the reticular activating system in your prefrontal cortex, and it really does help you get to your bigger goal. And I would also just like to go into what you shared about your teacher describing the symptoms of ADHD without labeling it or recommending anything. That is so common. And one thing is, I've discussed it before, that not every teacher is educated in ADHD. Even doctors, not everyone knows about the science of ADHD, but
Right.
also teachers aren't legally, I know
Mm,
this from being an administrator in special education, they're not legally allowed to say you should go for an ADHD diagnosis or you should go for this diagnosis, because if they do, what happens is that the school district very often will have to pay for that test at that point. So they can't recommend something officially or unofficially without the school then
yes.
having to provide it.
That makes so much sense. And another thing that always comes to mind and something I think about often is just like I grew up with privilege. Like I had privilege where my parents could send me to private testing. And I think about it all the time because I don't know how my schooling would have ended up and where I would have ended up had I not had the privilege of being able to get tutoring and, get that extra help and attention that I
That's
so badly
supplementary.
needed. And it
Mhm.
should be in every school, and it's not. Our school systems are failing us and they're failing, folks who do have ADHD.
Absolutely. So you went to Columbia Prep, right?
Mhm.
How many people were in your class?
I had a small class of 95 students, but in addition to that, Columbia Prep is known for their Learning Resource Center, LRC. So I had the opportunity of working with people during the day and taking slower classes. So instead of having, Spanish 1, I had Spanish 1A, Spanish 1B. I was able to take it at a slower pace, which
Ah,
also
okay. You broke it
really
down.
broke it down. And I was given so many tools as far as organization and scheduling, things that I incorporate every single day now, being a business owner. And I feel so
Mhm.
grateful that I have that opportunity to be able to learn just how to manage a lot of the symptoms that come with ADHD.
Now, were those tools given to you after you got the ADHD diagnosis and you started the medication?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So
Well,
without the,
actually, you know what? I'm sorry, I spoke. I started the LRC program in 7th grade and I was formally diagnosed in 8th grade. I think they knew there was some slower learning, maybe some learning disabilities, but the ADHD diagnosis did not come until a year later. But without the medication, it was really hard for me to actually put into place a lot of the things that they were discussing just because the way the school system's set up, like you're waking up at 7 a.m. or 6:30 and you're going straight for like 8 hours. Like that's really hard.
sure, absolutely. I mean, I think it's hard for anyone to focus.
Yes.
Our brain is not meant to focus for 8 hours on end.
No.
So, okay, you mentioned that you were provided the organizational tools and the help with their executive functions at the private school. You went on medication. You were fortunate enough that the medication worked right away for you. Some people have to try all these different medications for 2 years before they find the right medication for them. And it was just like
Yeah.
you said, a light switch, everything changed.
It's interesting because if I say that the medication it definitely worked as far as helping me to focus, helping me to retain information, there were side effects. Like I was very irritable. I wasn't sleeping. I think I went to bed at like 1 or 2 in the morning every night because my
Mm,
body was so just like filled with energy and I was binge eating. Like I would skip breakfast, I would skip lunch, I would get home and I have this memory of just like ransacking my freezer and the refrigerator come 4 or 5 p.m. So it worked incredibly well for me and my brain in school and with my homework, but there were definitely side effects that were not spoken about and I was not told. And then years later, I
Mm,
kind of connected the dots of like what was going on.
yeah. So you likely were not eating until your medication would wear off and then you
Yeah.
binged.
Yep.
And what kind of toll did that have on you?
It's interesting because when we think about food during the day, it's almost counterproductive to take this medication to help you focus, and then you're not eating to sustain your energy and to
Right.
help you focus.
Focus. Right.
Yeah. And so that's like, those are things that I help my clients with now because I'm like, with the medication, we want to make sure that you're having like a solid breakfast, protein, carbs, and then at least something during the day. It took a toll because I was, eating so much later on in the evenings. It didn't, first of all, feel good. And it kind of set me up for this almost like restrict-binge cycle because I wasn't intentionally restricting, but I was binging. So I would eat really late at night and then I would wake up not hungry. And then I would eat late at
Mm,
night and then I would wake up not hungry. So I fell into this cycle, which was really hard. And it lasted throughout college as well.
that's interesting. It almost obviously it's binge eating, but it also sounds like what so many people say these days as intermittent fasting diet. So talk to me.
Interesting.
I'm sure you're not supposed to binge while you are doing an intermittent fasting. However, talk to me about like now you're a registered dietitian. You
Mhm.
help people with and without ADHD with food freedom. So how does your experience now play into how you help your clients today?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it gives me the lived experience. Like I've kind of been through it all, like generalized anxiety, ADHD. I've definitely struggled with disordered eating, possibly an undiagnosed eating disorder. I was never
Mhm.
diagnosed, but I think that there were definitely patterns and signs of that.
And you
So
said
it's
that you also had a learning disability.
I had issues reading and math was really hard for me. I never was diagnosed with anything like dyslexia. So I don't know what the actual learning disabilities were, but I definitely had issues with reading comprehension early on, and math has always been very hard.
Was it the word problems in the math or was it just math in general?
The
Okay.
oh my God. And during SAT prep, like the word problems, when they would say, if this person went 7 inches
Yeah,
and
it's
that's, oh,
extra confusing.
oh my God. Yeah. My brain just does not, it cannot
Yeah.
understand.
So with the reading comprehension, it may or may not have been a learning disability with a diagnosis of a reading learning
Yes.
disability, or it could have just been your ADHD where you were
Completely.
having trouble staying focused on the words, which then impacted your
Yes.
comprehension.
And I think it was the latter because once I was diagnosed with ADHD, like the conversation around learning disabilities pretty much went out the window outside of like the ADHD diagnosis.
Gotcha.
But going back to, you know, I have lived experience and I can understand what it's like to be on medication and not have any hunger signs. Like it really, it impacts your hunger and fullness. I've had experience of generalized anxiety, which we know has really strong connections to
Me
ADHD as
too.
well. It's
Mhm.
kind of, yeah, it's like the chicken or the
Yeah.
egg. Like what comes
Right.
first?
Right. And you have to really weed things out when getting the diagnosis. There is that overlap of symptoms with generalized anxiety disorder and ADHD, but is it one or the other, or is it both?
Exactly. Exactly. And in my case, it was definitely both. Like I've had anxiety since I was 5. I couldn't label it. I didn't know what I was experiencing, but looking back, like it was really debilitating to me from like a very young age.
How did
So
that go play into your ADHD?
that's such a good question. How did it kind of, I almost saw them as complementing one another. Like they lived alongside each other. I was never somebody who had terrible anxiety from, exam taking or anything to do with
Mhm.
that. But I something that does happen is I will procrastinate and then I all of a
Mhm.
sudden feel really overwhelmed and then I feel really anxious. So
Yes.
they definitely are connected. What's interesting is like throughout my life, I've seen them as two separate entities that have affected me. Like I have my ADHD and like I see my generalized anxiety. and I kind of work on both. But I do think there's such a strong overlap because if I'm able
Yes,
to manage some of the symptoms of ADHD, I notice a decrease in my anxiety.
totally. And so that for obviously, I'm not a therapist, but when people say, oh, do I have a generalized anxiety disorder or an anxiety disorder, or is the anxiety a manifestation of my ADHD? Well, if your ADHD symptoms are then manifesting the anxiety, then it's likely part of the ADHD. But if it's a standalone where you're experiencing anxiety pretty much in all areas of life that might not have to do with your ADHD, that's a generalized anxiety disorder.
Completely. Yeah, I would agree with that.
So how did you treat the generalized anxiety disorder?
So I have been in therapy for a really long time, and I started cognitive behavioral therapy because
So good, right?
it's the best. I was getting chronic panic attacks, like up to 7 a day. Um,
Wow.
I started CBT probably 10 years ago, which is funny because they're like, it's kind of like a shorter term
Yeah.
treatment, but I love my therapist. And she's now like my talk therapist who happens to use obviously the CBT techniques. And then I started Lexapro, and that has been a complete life changer. It's an anti-anxiety medication. It has allowed my generalized anxiety to sit so much lower. So the
Takes
threshold
the edge off.
totally takes the edge off. The way that my therapist used to describe panic attacks to me is like when your generalized anxiety is higher, there's less room to jump from anxiety to panic. But now that my anxiety is so much lower, that threshold is so much greater. So for me to get to a panic attack, like I cannot tell you the last time I've had panic, which is huge considering I would have chronic panic attacks multiple times a day.
Wow. So the Lexapro and a stimulant, you're taking the stimulant for ADHD and the Lexapro for anxiety.
And now I'm actually taking no stimulants.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So how are we managing our ADHD?
Okay. So it is hard. And it goes back to the symptoms. And I've spoken to people and they've said, well, maybe you're not on the right stimulant. I've tried almost all of them at this point. I don't love my personality on them. Like I joke that my fiance will say, like, did you take your like Adderall today? Because I'm like in a bad mood. And I'm like, no, I'm just in a bad mood. Like it's nothing to do with medication. But I will sometimes take the medication. So I would say about once or twice a month when I have so much work that I need to power through, I will take the Adderall. But from a day to day, I am able to show up for my clients, because I'm so interested in what it is that they're saying, I'm able to really be able to focus. And I've learned to manage in my own way. So, for example, I try to go for walks, I exercise. I'm always consistently eating food. I try to get good quality sleep. Does it cure, like quote unquote, fix the ADHD? Absolutely not. But
No.
I have tools that I'm able to manage it. And I'm also learning to give myself more compassion because I used to have so much shame when I felt completely unmotivated. I felt like I was doing absolutely no work some days. And I've learned to give myself compassion. Like, it's okay if that's what's going on. But I find like always writing out a schedule, always having to-do lists. I'm really good with my calendar. If it's not on the calendar, it doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist. Yep.
Does not exist. So I have learned to manage my own life. And also with the impulsivity, which I've found to be a huge part of my ADHD, that's something I work on every single day. I work on in therapy. I used to blurt out and like respond to things. Now I write things down. Like if I'm in session with someone and something's coming to mind, I don't want to forget it. I jot it down.
Yeah. So you parking lot it, you put it on a Post-it, you put it down so you don't have to interrupt them.
Exactly.
I used to do that with my students who are impulsive. Here's a whiteboard. Here's some Post-its. If you have a thought and you can't hold it in, write it on the Post-it, put it on the whiteboard, and we'll see it and get to it when it's the right time.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And that way it's like you're validating someone. Like it's hard because I will forget sometimes and I'm so curious, like your experience too, but I've had to have many conversations with my fiance, who is the most neurotypical person you will ever meet. If he says, I'm going to do X, he actually does it, like, and he does it immediately. Whereas
Uh-huh.
I will say I'm going to do this and then I like linger and then I forget and then he reminds
Uh-huh.
me. So we've had many conversations where I am always teaching him about ADHD. I'm explaining to him why I do the things that I do in a certain way. And he's helping me, by writing lists for me. And so that I can help remember, he will remind me to do certain things in like a really not pushy way, but just like in a gentle, like nudge type way. And it
Mhm.
really
Mhm.
works. And
Mhm.
I'm
You don't feel
grateful.
like he's parenting you. You feel like it's just him helping you with your executive functions.
So in the beginning, it did feel like parenting. And then we had to have conversations around it because it felt a little bit like parenting. And I said, I feel like I'm being parented and it doesn't feel good. And he said, like, how can I help you? Like, how can I support you in a way that doesn't feel like I'm parenting you? And so we've had like multiple conversations. I bought him a book. I think it's called When You Love Someone with ADHD,
Uh-huh.
which like you might have
Yep.
recommended actually.
Uh-huh. I did.
Yeah. And so it's an ongoing conversation, but I think he has such a better understanding now than when we first, met each other. But it's hard for someone who doesn't have the lived experience to fully understand and grasp like
Mhm.
what it's like to be in my body and with my brain.
Absolutely. So he's helping you in a way that's working for the relationship where you don't
Yes.
feel like he's parenting you. You
Yes.
communicated, your needs and where it would be too much, where you don't have that parent-child relationship. And when you're doing something you love, working, helping clients, you're able to really hyper focus into what they're saying and
Yes.
put down the thoughts on, a post-it or a piece of paper to come back to when it's the appropriate time.
Yes.
And then how are you managing notes and all those other fun things?
Yes. So you mean like when I'm working in sessions?
Mhm.
So I have a portal where I'm meeting clients, like an EMR, electronic medical
Mhm.
record. So on one screen, it's my client's face because I'm 100% virtual, and then I'm taking notes. And for me, I think one of the biggest things is not having to write every single thing down that they're saying so I could be more
Yes.
present in conversation. That's been something that I'm learning over time. And just jotting down things that I A want to remember or B are noteworthy and possibly will come up again in future sessions. So it's been fine as far as note taking goes, but that's been a little bit more of a process of knowing exactly what's necessary to write down versus like wanting to
Yes.
write down every single
Everything.
thing. Yeah.
It reminds me of when we're reading in school and we just highlight
The
every
entire
single
book.
thing,
That is
right?
so
I used to
there
do that.
yes, that is too funny because in my textbook, the entire page would be yellow. It
Oh,
was just
yeah. Oh, yeah.
yellow
Right.
lines.
So what's the point?
That is so funny. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. I used to not actually give highlighters to my students with ADHD because it was more of a distraction to them than
Mm,
it was a help. So they
yes.
had pieces of paper to block out the rest of the lines and they would focus on what
Interesting.
it was important. And then afterwards, summarize what they just read rather than underlining or highlighting.
Yeah, that's really smart.
So
Yeah.
you figured out systems that work for you. You live and die on your schedule and your calendar. And how do you use your calendar?
So I have my Google Calendar is kind of like my primary calendar. Every single meeting is on there. And if I put reminders in there. So, for example, we were getting a box of chocolate delivered to our apartment yesterday. I knew if it wasn't written down in my calendar, I would forget to get it and it would melt.
Mhm.
So, on top of my calendar, it's like reminder, buy chocolate, like bring chocolates upstairs. And so I have reminders on there. I have all my meetings on there. If I want to follow up with someone, let's say a client paused work for a month and they say, I would love to get back in touch next month. I will go a month ahead and put in my note,
Mm.
follow up with this person. So I have that calendar. And then I actually recently purchased this great template and it's not online. It's like a paper template where it's a full schedule. So it's like, again,
Mhm.
similar to what I have on my calendar.
Google.
But then on the left side, there's tasks, things you have to do. But what's great about this is at the top of the page, it says your three primary top goals for today. Because
Yes.
what I have found is I have 40 goals and then I'm overwhelmed and then I do none of them.
Yes.
So
Yes.
3 tasks that I want to make sure I complete today. Done.
That's it. Yes.
Yes. And
Yes.
if I get to
Yeah.
more, great. But those are
Great.
the 3 tasks.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So talk to me about how you overcame binge eating.
So with binge eating, I think first being off the medication was helpful for me
Hmm.
for that time being. It was also just gaining awareness because I did going back on the medication. So it's not that the medication itself causes binge eating disorder. It puts
Hmm.
you at slightly higher risk for it just because it's depleting your appetite during the day. So I'll kind of discuss both. When I was on the medication, one way to reduce the binge eating was making sure I have a big breakfast before I take the medication. And I know this is hard for some people because some people are just not hungry in the morning. So anything that sounds good to you, anything I
A
find
smoothie.
smoothies, I even find more carb like foods people tend to do better with. So even if you did like a waffle with peanut butter or peanut butter toast, something like that for lunch, something like soup or smoothie, a protein shake where you can have something to drink during the day, maybe a peanut butter sandwich, something very easy that you can physically see yourself eating is the
Yeah.
primary. And then at nighttime, hopefully by then you're not so famished. But my binge eating was also coupled with dieting. So, yes, it was ADHD and, it was related to the ADHD and the medication, but I was also intentionally restricting food for,
Mm.
different points of my life. I was always on a diet. I was seeing nutritionists from the age of 12. And so that I took a longer time to kind of overcome. For me, there's so many different factors as to how I stopped binging. It was compassion for myself. It was making sure I was eating enough during the day. That's a really big
Hmm.
one. People often see binge eating as eating, you know, too much or this like loss of control. It's actually a restrictive eating disorder. If you're
Mm.
binging, you are restricting. So we want to figure out, when you're restricting, why are you restricting? Is it because you're just not hungry because of the medication? Or is it because you're intentionally trying to restrict? And there can be so much shame in binging. Like I remember in episodes of when I binge, like I just felt so ashamed. And then you don't want to talk to anyone about it because it's like, how did I let this happen? I fully lost control. But being able to talk to someone about it and opening up about it can help reduce some of that shame because there's nothing to feel ashamed about. It's just
Hmm.
we want to figure out why is this going on and how can we, support you in stopping.
Do you just random thought think that because society is now more accepting of all bodies, ads have, full shape models? Do you think that that's helping also some of the young folks who you're seeing or who are moving up in the rankings?
So I think that we as a society have still so much work to do. And what
Hmm.
I've noticed, especially even like parents of my clients, we've all been conditioned to really idolize thinness.
Hmm.
And for a lot of people, we view fatness as lack of health or laziness. And it's so not the case. Like there are people in all size bodies that exist in their bodies. And a lot of it has to do with genetics. Like that's just how your body is wired. And when you try to fight your set point, your body's going to fight back. And that's why
Sure.
it's really, really hard to actually lose weight and keep it off. So I think that we're really moving in the right direction. This new generation on TikTok, I'm really excited about because there's much more acceptance that is happening. And yet I still think that we have a lot of work to do. But my hope is that people can start to accept their bodies and love themselves more and be kinder. Like we're so mean to ourselves. And I think this goes back to the
Mhm.
ADHD piece too. Like for so many years, I was so frustrated with how my brain was. And I was angry at times and I was, mad because I'm like, this isn't fair. That's so much easier for some of my peers. And over
Mhm.
the years, I have learned to become so much more compassionate with myself. And it's completely changed the way I view my ADHD. Like I'm trying to see it for there's a ton of benefits to it. And you and your groups and social media has really helped me into accepting ADHD, which is so cool.
Yeah. Well, I loved having you as a client with 3C Activation. You were an amazing group member. And I still remember to this day you texting the group a year after you finished the group saying, I, for the first time, accomplished all the goals on my list
Yes.
annually. Yeah.
Yes. And
So that's really cool.
it was that group that helped me. I have my real estate license. It's like a fun, like side hustle. I don't know if I would have been able to do that without the group because I needed the extra push and the motivation and the check-ins. It was really, really helpful for my own accountability. And just having the support of other people being like, yeah, I totally get it. Like I've been there. Like I
Mhm.
understand. It's so eye-opening because like I'm not alone in this. Like there are so many other people who get it and who are dealing with the same thing that I am.
Absolutely. So, if someone is having difficulty with eating and they need help getting over their fear of food, where can they reach you?
Yes. So I'm mostly hanging out on Instagram, no food fears. And I realize that I did not send you any of my info, but maybe we'll put my website into the show notes.
Maybe you'll
Maybe.
send it to me. Maybe you'll put it on your
No.
calendar.
Yes, I'm gonna put it on my calendar, but my website is brittanymodelrd.com. And you can reach me there. And I'm always looking for people who are interested in just having a kinder, gentle way of connecting to their bodies and connecting to food because I think there can be so much judgment that we're experiencing day to day, and just learning to be okay with where you are is the most empowering thing you can do.
So, that would be your number one pro tip, learning to be okay with where you are, you think?
Not striving for perfection. And I think
Mm,
this also can fall
doesn't
into the
exist.
ADHD. Yeah. There's such black and white thinking with people that I work with where it's like, I'm either 100% doing this or I'm 100% not doing this. And, with dieting, you're either 100% on it or you're 100% off of it. Like there's no middle
Hmm.
ground. With the work that I do, there's this gray area that people feel uncomfortable to sit in because, like, well, I feel like I should be doing this 100%, but that's where the compassion comes in, the permission to just do the best you can. Like you don't have to go 100%.
Right, right. We're not going to be excited to restrict ourselves over time. And in fact, it will have a negative impact on us in anything, right? If we have to be a
Yes.
certain way, we're going to strive until we hit some road bumps and then we're going to go the opposite way. So in life, we can't be so attached to the outcome. We have to
Yes.
think about the process and enjoy it.
Yes. And to be present and to, it's hard for someone with generalized anxiety to not worry about the future, not worry about everything. But really trying to just be present and enjoy what's happening right now. And if there's something to worry about in 6 months, a year, 2 years, I can worry about it then. I don't need to spend my energy and worry about it now because that's what I spent years doing. It's just like, what's going to happen, at this point? Or it's like, for what
Yeah.
reason? Like none of it even happened.
Exactly. And that CBT must be really helpful with
Yes.
that, along with the antidepressant.
Yes.
Yeah.
100%.
Well, thank you for being on another episode of Successful with ADHD. It's wonderful to see your face, Brittany.
Yeah. So fun. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Successful with ADHD. I hope it helps you on your journey. And if you need any additional support for you or a loved one with ADHD, feel free to reach out to us at Coaching with Brooke unintended.com and all social media platforms at Coaching with Brooke. And remember, it's Brooke with an E. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.